Hi everybody, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to my vegetable garden. Well, here we are going into the middle of July and we have a week of 90+ degree weather ahead of us. I'm not looking forward to that at all. But here I am, it's early morning and the temperature is reasonably nice, so I figured this is the perfect time to do the video. So what's on tap for today? I wanted to share some midsummer vegetable growing tips with you to help you be more successful in the garden. I've got my sun hat, I've got my sunscreen on, so let's get started. For those of you who are new to my videos, I wanted to let you know that I live in Spokane, Washington, which is about 300 miles east of Seattle. We have very cold winters, pretty dry summers, and this garden is in Zone 5B. Most of Spokane is in Zone 6. We managed to buy property right in the middle of a microclimate. One of the best tips I want to share with you today is the importance of monitoring your garden on a regular basis and daily if you can do it. You know, it's mighty pleasant, I think, because you get to go out and see how everything is growing, listen to the birds singing, watch the butterflies, and so on. Now, the reason this is important is if there are any problems occurring in your garden, whether it's an insect pest problem or a disease problem, you will spot it early on and have more options for controlling the problem. And of course, you might come across something wonderful like the first ripe tomato or your first zucchini. So really, overall, monitoring your garden on a regular basis, in addition to making good sense, it's just a pleasant way of spending a few minutes out of your day. When I did the vegetable garden update a couple of weeks ago, I was lamenting on how small my tomato plants were, and that's because we've had a very wet, cold spring, and it has set everything back. However, look at how much better these tomatoes look. These ones are Chef's Choice Orange and Mortgage Lifter, so slicing tomatoes, and I'm very happy to say that they've put on a lot of growth, they're blooming and doing well. But there's a couple of things I like to do to the tomato plants at this stage of the game so that they will grow well. One thing that I'm always looking for is if there are any low branches of the tomato plants that are touching the ground. Now, I have put mulch on the soil surface, and that's to impede weed growth and also to help the soil retain its moisture. I can see I need to put another layer of mulch on here, but my point is that the mulch is more or less preventing the leaf surface from touching the soil. Now, there can be pathogens in the soil, and when the plant's leaves touch the soil, it can be easy for those disease pathogens to get splashed up onto the leaves. That's not good. So what I like to do is take a little pruners, and I very carefully follow it up to where it attaches to the branch, and then I clip it off. And I want to emphasize very carefully, because the last thing you want to do is cut a main stem off your plant. That would be awful. So I'm going to go around this bed and the other two tomato beds and make sure there's nothing that's touching the soil. Now, if you've seen other videos of mine, you probably already know the support system that I'm using for the tomatoes. This is a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet of concrete reinforcing wire, and I have it attached to two very sturdy metal fence posts. And what I do is every now and then I run a piece of jute twine along to make sure the plants are staying close to this wire grid for good support. So that's something I also will check, about every week or two. And once again, if you have them sprawling on the ground, there's more chance for diseases, so you don't want that to happen. I'm growing two types of paste tomatoes in the other two beds, and I wanted to point out a couple of things that you might find of interest. Do you see how these leaves at the top are kind of droopy looking? You might think they're not getting enough water. There is something about the two varieties I'm growing, Gilberti and Federle, where they just do that, especially early in the season, and then they perk up later and are incredibly productive. We have a good friend who's a market gardener in a community north of Spokane, and he's growing the same varieties and having the exact same problem. So I don't feel it's a disease problem in my garden, thank heavens. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that if you see the leaves of your tomato rolling, that is something that's called physiological leaf roll. It's not a disease, but rather the plant's reaction to something that's environmental, such as colder than usual temperatures in the spring or hotter temperatures in the summer. The interesting thing about it is that scientists aren't really 100% sure why plants do that, but they think it's a way for the plant to conserve moisture or as a reaction to unusual weather. It seems like certain varieties are more prone to physiological leaf roll. Last year I grew some Costaludo Genovese tomatoes, and their leaves were rolled up for almost the entire summer. Yet the plants were healthy and very productive. So when you see something that's out of the ordinary on a plant, carefully examine the entire plant first before deciding if it's a problem. Do you see spots on the leaves? Do you see insects? All of these things are what you need to take into account before you decide if there's a serious problem going on in your garden. Now, speaking of the coming 90-degree temperatures, we are going to use some shade cloth in our garden, primarily over the tomatoes. In the foreground here, you can't tell very well, but this is shade cloth on top of the broccoli bed just to give it a little bit of protection. The shade cloth is very handy, and it reduces the intensity of that heat and light for the plants so they can more easily get through stressful conditions. Now this is our garlic patch, and you might think, boy, it's not looking very good, but it's looking exactly how it should this time of year for the most part. We planted individual cloves last fall. They went through the winter under mulch and started coming up. Some of the leaves have brown tips, and that's because we had an incredibly cold spring, and so I think some of the leaf tips got frosted a bit. But otherwise the plants are growing great, and we will know that they're ready to be harvested when the lowest 4 to 5 leaves coming off of the main stem have turned brown. So they've still got a little ways to go, but we're keeping an eye on them. Another thing that's important to do throughout the growing season is to keep up with the weeds, or in this case, this is a volunteer catmint plant, and I do not need it in the middle of my artichoke patch. The thing with weeds is that they compete with our plants for moisture, nutrients, and space. And so if you pull the weeds as soon as you see them, that makes it pretty simple. I can put this in the compost pile and it will contribute to the garden next year. But it's just so important to keep up with them. I know it's not a fun task, but it's crucial that you keep the weeds out of your garden. Phew, it's getting hot out here already. You might recall that I'm growing cucurbits, so squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, and so on this livestock panel arbor. Some people call them cattle panels, and so it's going up and over a pathway between two of our raised beds. So one of the things that I like to do is to make sure that the vines are still growing up rather than out into the pathways. But you can see this little cucumber vine is heading in the wrong direction. So every so often I check on them and I make sure that they're close to the support. Now, while we're talking about squash vines, I also wanted to point out something. If you've ever wondered which flowers are males and which are females, this one is a male. If I carefully pull it up here, you can see there's no bulbous base to it. There's just the stem sticking into it. So that's the male. Now let me show you what a female looks like. Okay, so here is a female squash flower. Do you see how it has the bulbous base? This is like a little baby squash. If this flower does not get pollinated, then this is going to shrivel up and fall off. And chances are you've seen that happen. So I wanted to show you how easy it is to hand pollinate squash flowers. And you'll notice I've got a little pollinator in here, which is kind of funny. So I just went and picked a male flower, and you can see it's just the flower attached to the stem. It does not have that little baby squash at the base. And to hand pollinate them, what you do on the male flower is you remove the petals carefully. Seems a shame, they're such pretty flowers. And that is to expose the anther of the male flower. That is this part right here. So now that these petals are out of the way, I can pollinate that flower we just looked at. This is the male flower. Here's the anther, and what's on the anther is the pollen that we want to transfer to the female flower onto the stigma. So all I need to do is take the anther and rub it onto the stigma of the female flower to transfer the pollen. And that's pretty much it. So what would cause a lack of pollination in squash flowers and other blooms? Well, for one thing, a lack of pollinators is definitely a showstopper. And what typically causes that is the use of pesticides. And maybe you don't use pesticides, but you have a close neighbor who does. And the problem with pesticides is they are non-selective. Sure, they're going to kill the insect you're trying to get rid of, that's a pest, but it will also kill the beneficial insects, such as predatory insects and pollinators, that would have helped you out with pollination or preying upon the damaging insects. So it's really important that we avoid the use of pesticides, and really there's no place for pesticides anywhere near edible crops because you don't want to eat that stuff. So that could be a cause of lack of pollination. It could also be the weather. Now you know the very simple method for hand pollinating squash blossoms. Well, this isn't necessarily what I wanted to see. This is Mr. Buns. No, he is not a pet. I don't even know if it's a he, but it has been visiting our garden a little bit, not doing any damage, and so far we are on reasonable terms. And you have to admit, he is kind of cute. You can see our pole bean arbor is doing great. They have already made it up to the center. This one wins the prize. And you can see every now and then they start heading in the wrong direction, so I carefully help them find their way. When I was planting these, I was pointing out how plants tend to want to grow towards the south. And so I very carefully planted all of these seedlings on the north side of this side of the support, so they would grow into the support. Well, some of the plants don't get the message, apparently. But anyway, they're growing really well. I chose Vortex and Rattlesnake pole beans because both of these varieties are supposed to do well with the heat. They're more tolerant of it. So I thought, well, you know, it's always fun to try a new variety anyway, so we're trying two varieties. But again, this is something where I just kind of monitor it, and if I see a vine heading off in the wrong direction, then I go ahead and get it going in the right direction again. But for the most part, these don't need a whole lot of effort. They are blooming, so I do hope to see beans soon. And as I mentioned in a previous video, everything is developing a little bit later. You probably have beans on your bean plants already. We're getting there. Pretty soon, I think. Now, I showed you this bed a couple of weeks ago for the vegetable garden update, and what a difference. So this bed has Cocozelle zucchini growing in it, Goldilocks bush style of acorn squash, and a type of cantaloupe. So in the foreground, those massive plants are the Goldilocks and Cocozelle plants. Okay, let's see if I can point out one of the developing Cocozelle zucchinis. You can see it right here. They have stripes on them. This is the second year we've grown them. Last year they grew like nobody's business and produced so many zucchini for us. Last year I had 3 plants. This year I decided to do 2 so we don't get too overwhelmed. But my tip to you is to harvest your zucchini while they're young and tender. The more you harvest, the more the plants will produce. I would wait until this is a little larger though. Here is a young developing Goldilocks acorn squash. We grew these last year for the first time as well, and they are fantastic. When they're mature, they're going to be a bright orange. They are delicious, they're very prolific, and they keep really well in storage. We are still eating a few from last year's crop. I definitely recommend it. Another reason I really like this variety is because it's a bush form plant rather than a vine that sprawls all over the place. So they're very compact, they don't take up much room in the garden at all. Here's part of the melon patch, and they just suddenly burst into growth. They're vining all over the place, there's flowers everywhere. I don't see any new little melons just yet, but this is another great one. I'll put the name of the variety on the screen because this one has got a very long name and I might not do it justice in the pronunciation department. You can see our 2 beds of corn have also leapt into action. This is Sweetness Bicolor. It's a variety we've grown for years and we just love it. And so the plants are doing really well. They're even starting the very beginning process of tasseling. And what I wanted to point out is that corn plants have very short stubby roots. And if you have a strong windstorm and your garden is in a windy spot with no protection, it can be very easy for the plants to just snap at the base and then they're done. And it is heartbreaking. It has happened to me off and on. So years ago, I decided to implement a support strategy. It's not hard to do. And you know, when you're growing corn in raised beds, it's very difficult to add additional soil around the base of the plants, which is called hilling up. However, what I like to do is I have some metal conduit posts here, and I have just slipped them around the perimeter of the bed, and then I have taken jute twine at about this height here and gone around the perimeter to give them some support. I'll do it again when the corn plants are a little taller. And what will happen is if there's a windstorm, because we do have a very open area here and our wind comes from the southwest. What will happen though is they might move a little bit in the wind, but not so much that they snap at the base. So this is a very simple method. I've just got these posts lying around and some jute twine, and that's all there is to it. One last thing I wanted to mention has to do with our gutter pea patch. And if you haven't heard the term gutter peas before, I've done lots of videos on it. Just go to my YouTube channel and do a search for gutter peas and you'll see what the technique is. It works really well for very quickly planting massive amounts of pea seedlings. What I wanted to tell you is that these peas are just about done for this season. We've gotten 5 harvests off of them. We're going to pick them at least one more time, but with the 90-degree temperatures coming, they are not going to like it. They are a cool season crop that definitely will shut down everything when it gets that hot. So the interesting thing is that we're going to do a succession planting. As soon as we've finished harvesting them, we are going to plant corn seedlings that we've already started because we feel we will have enough time to get an extra harvest of corn. So that's pretty cool. And I'll have to show you that when we get to that point. But the peas have been great. They got off to a horrible start, again, because of our very cold, very wet, and occasionally snowy spring. And then they finally came into their own. We've been enjoying wonderful sweet peas. These are Green Arrow, our favorite variety. And pretty soon they're going to be coming out of this bed, but I will compost them because that is going to be a lot of nice nitrogen to add to that compost pile and eventually to the soil in this garden. Well, I've headed into the shade because it's getting very hot, so I'm done outside for the day. And the sound that you're hearing is coming from our water garden right next to me. It's very soothing. I hope you found today's video interesting and helpful. Thanks so much for watching today, and I'll see you next week. Happy gardening!